The Tonight Show was meant to begin with jokes and music, but Johnny Carson did something no one expected. He halted everything, signaled the band to stop, and asked 20 million viewers to pause, with him to recognize a crew member's unimaginable loss. What followed left a lasting mark on television history. February 11th, 1979. It was a Monday evening, and The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson was getting ready for its usual broadcast. The studio audience was seated, filled with energy and anticipation. Doc Severinsen and his band were set, prepared to play the familiar Tonight Show theme. Ed McMahon was looking over his notes for the introduction. Everything was moving as expected, but behind the scenes, something was unfolding that would shift the course of the night in a way no one could have predicted. James Patterson, a veteran camera operator who had worked on the Tonight Show since 1965, had come to the studio that afternoon despite having received the kind of news no parent should ever face. Earlier that morning, his 6-year-old son, Michael, had died in a car accident on his way to school. A drunk driver had ignored a red light, and Michael's life ended instantly. James had called the studio to explain that he couldn't come in, but his supervisor misunderstood and assumed James was simply running behind. When James arrived at NBC, not to work, but to gather his belongings because he couldn't imagine staying there, news of what had happened spread quickly through the crew. Johnny Carson was in his dressing room, reviewing his monologue when Fred Dortiva knocked on the door. Fred's face was pale, and Johnny sensed trouble. Immediately, "Johnny, we have a situation," Fred said quietly. "James Patterson's son passed away this morning. Car accident. The boy was only 6. Johnny felt the weight of the news. He had known James for nearly 15 years. Knew James' wife, Margaret, had seen pictures of young Michael and had heard James proudly talk about his son learning to read. "Where's James now?" Johnny asked. "Where is he?" "He's in the equipment room gathering his things," Fred replied. "He said he just needed to collect his belongings, and then he'd leave. He even apologized for the inconvenience." Johnny stood up, setting his monologue notes aside. "He apologized? His son just passed away, and he's apologizing to us." "He's in shock, Johnny. All of us are." Johnny paused for a moment, then said something that would shape one of the most remembered moments in television. "We're not doing the show the usual way tonight." Fred Dortiva looked uncertain. "What do you mean, Johnny?" "We have a full studio audience, scheduled guests, and sponsors counting on us." "I don't care," Johnny said, his tone steady but emotional. "Someone from our team just lost his child. We're not going to pretend nothing happened. We're not going to crack jokes and act as if everything is fine when it isn't." "What would you like to do?" Fred asked. "I want to acknowledge Michael," Johnny said. "And I want James to understand he isn't facing this alone, that we're standing with him, and that his son's life mattered." Within minutes, Johnny brought together the entire crew, camera operators, sound teams, lighting staff, production assistants, makeup artists, everyone who helped make The Tonight Show run each day. He explained what he intended to do and asked if anyone disagreed. No one did. When The Tonight Show began that night, the shift in tone was clear immediately. The usual upbeat opening music did not play. Doc Severinsen's band remained silent. Ed McMahon did not deliver his familiar introduction. Instead, the curtain opened to reveal Johnny Carson standing alone on the stage, looking more serious than audiences were accustomed to. The studio crowd, expecting humor and energy, could tell at once that something was wrong. The lively conversations faded into whispers, then into total quiet. Johnny stepped to the center of the stage and looked into the camera. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm and subdued. "Before we begin tonight's show, I need to share something with you, and I need to ask something of you." The audience sat motionless, focused on every word. This morning, a 6-year-old boy named Michael Patterson was killed in a car accident on his way to school. Michael was the son of James Patterson, who has worked as a camera operator on this show for nearly 15 years. James is not only a member of our crew, he is part of our family. And today, our family is deeply saddened. Johnny paused, taking a moment before continuing. James came in today only to pick up his belongings. He didn't want to cause any trouble or interrupt the show. That alone speaks to the kind of person James Patterson is. But tonight, we are interrupting the show, Johnny said, because some things matter more than entertainment. Some losses cannot be overlooked, and some people deserve recognition. Johnny turned his attention to both the audience in the room and the millions watching across the country. I'm asking all of you to join me in something we've never done before on this program. I'm asking you to sit with me in silence for 3 minutes, to honor the memory of Michael Patterson, and to show James that his son mattered, that his grief matters, and that he is not alone. The request lingered in the air. It was something The Tonight Show had never attempted. Television programs didn't do things like this. Viewers tuned in for entertainment, not for silence or sorrow. But Johnny Carson recognized something important about human connection, that at times, the most meaningful act we can offer someone in pain is to acknowledge their loss and stand with them. James, Johnny said, looking directly into one of the cameras. If you're watching from home, or if you're somewhere here in the building, I want you to know that we care about you, and we are deeply sorry for your loss. Michael visited us once when you brought him to the studio. He was a bright, wonderful child, and the world is smaller without him. Then Johnny did something no talk show host had ever done before. He stood at center stage and remained completely silent. The studio audience stayed quiet as well, fully aware of the weight of the moment. Doc Severinsen and his musicians sat still at their instruments. Ed McMahon stood nearby, tears running down his face. The cameras stayed focused on Johnny, who stood with his head slightly lowered, hands clasped, eyes closed. For 3 uninterrupted minutes, The Tonight Show, America's leading entertainment program, became a tribute to a 6-year-old boy, whom most viewers had never heard of until that evening. It was one of the most meaningful silences ever broadcast on television. When the 3 minutes ended, Johnny lifted his head and spoke again, his voice heavy with emotion. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for honoring Michael. And thank you for supporting James in his grief." Then something unexpected occurred. The audience began to applaud. Not the usual energetic Tonight Show applause, but something gentler, respectful, emotional, and sincere. It was the sound of 300 people recognizing that they had taken part in something important. Johnny raised his hand to quiet them. "We're going to continue with tonight's show now, because that's what we do," he said. "But I want you to remember that behind every television program, every film, every piece of entertainment you enjoy, there are countless people you never see who make it all possible. People like James Patterson. People who come to work even when life is difficult, who perform their roles with pride and professionalism, and who deserve our appreciation and respect. James, we are dedicating tonight's show to Michael, and we're here for you, whatever you need, for as long as you need it." The Tonight Show that followed those 3 minutes of silence was unlike any other episode. Johnny's humor was softer, not as sharp. His conversations with guests were more reflective, centered on genuine connection rather than quick jokes. The guests themselves, having been told what took place, approached their segments with an uncommon sense of care and respect. It was still The Tonight Show, still engaging, but it carried an awareness that real life, with its challenges and losses, existed beyond the stage and the laughter. The response to Johnny's tribute was extraordinary. The NBC switchboard received more than 15,000 calls in the hours after the episode aired, but unlike the usual feedback about comedy routines or celebrity visits, these calls were different. Viewers thanked Johnny for acknowledging grief on national television. Parents who had lost children said they felt understood and supported. Television critics, who were at first uncertain about interrupting an entertainment program for such a serious moment, later praised Johnny for his compassion and sincerity. One letter sent to NBC, later framed in Johnny's office, read, "In a world that often tells us to hide our grief and keep smiling, you showed us that it's acceptable to pause and recognize loss. You reminded us that people matter more than any program." James Patterson did not return to work for 3 months. During that period, Johnny Carson and the entire Tonight Show team supported him in many ways. Johnny called James every week. The crew arranged meal deliveries to his home. Members of the staff attended Michael's funeral, filling an entire section of the church. When James came back in May 1979, Johnny paused the pre-show meeting to welcome him. The crew gave him a standing ovation, not simply for returning, but for the strength it took to continue living after such an unimaginable loss. "I watched that broadcast," James told Johnny privately. "I saw what you did, and those 3 minutes meant more to Margaret and me than I can explain. You didn't have to do that. You could have sent flowers or called, but you stopped your show watched by millions, to honor our son. I'll never forget that." Johnny Carson's decision to honor Michael Patterson influenced the entire television industry. Other productions began recognizing that the people behind the cameras had lives, families, and challenges that deserved support. The idea of helping employees through grief became more intentional. NBC created new bereavement policies, and other networks soon followed. The concept of a workplace family shifted from a slogan to something practical. Mental health experts who studied grief began using footage of those 3 minutes as an example of how communities can collectively acknowledge loss. The simple act of pausing to recognize someone's pain became understood as a meaningful form of support. For the remainder of his career, Johnny Carson rarely spoke publicly about that night. When asked, he would only say, "James Patterson is a good man who suffered a terrible loss, and we did what anyone should do. We were there for him." But to those who worked beside him, that night showed who Johnny truly was. Not just the entertainer or the television icon, but a person who believed that people mattered more than ratings, that empathy outweighed comedy, and that sometimes the strongest act is simply to pause and acknowledge someone's pain. James Patterson continued working as a camera operator on The Tonight Show until Johnny's final episode in 1992. On that last night, when the credits rolled and the crew was recognized, James stood in the wings with tears in his eyes, holding a photo of his son, Michael. Today, when television historians review key moments in broadcasting, those 3 minutes of silence are always included, not for entertainment value, but for their authenticity. They marked a moment when television shifted from ratings and advertising towards something more meaningful, the acknowledgement of human loss and the impact of collective compassion. Johnny Carson paused The Tonight Show, not because of a production issue, but because something profoundly wrong had happened in the life of someone he cared about. By choosing silence over performance and humanity over programming, he created one of the most significant moments in television history. Those 3 minutes taught America that it is acceptable to stop, to recognize loss, and to sit with grief instead of rushing past it. They demonstrated that sometimes the most important thing a leader can do is simply say, "This person matters. This loss matters, and we will honor it together." If this story of leadership and compassion moved you, consider subscribing for more true accounts of the moments when television showed us the best of humanity. Share this video with someone who works behind the scenes and remind them that their work and their life matters. Sometimes the most meaningful thing we can do is pause, recognize someone's pain, and let them know they're not alone. This concludes our Johnny Carson series. Thank you for joining us as we looked back on the moments when America's favorite host showed that real greatness is not measured by ratings or applause, but by how we treat others when it matters most.